Hey, Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
Well, guess what? Whether you like it or not, you have me for the next 2 days. So, I'm going to be sharing on the topic of understanding the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls, as it relates and pertains to the New Testament, particularly Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, and then ultimately the ministry of Paul. And so something that over my years, let's say I started going to church when I was 5-6 years of age, and I'm now 61. So let's round it off to 50 years. So in my 50 years of going to church and being in the church atmosphere and the church environment, I never heard a statement that the historical and cultural context of the New Testament is intense, deeply involved Jewish religious dispute. And it's never been framed for us regarding that really is the setting of the New Testament. That's really is the setting of the Gospels. And if you really want to understand better and more deeply what's going on when you're reading the New Testament, you need to understand the background of this religious dispute and what the various sides believed. However, when we're being taught the New Testament, when we're even being taught things in the Gospels, for the most part, I would say our teachers are not aware of the belief system of, say, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, or even the Jewish group that was in the Qumran community. Therefore, when you're reading the text, they're not going to be understanding and aware of whether an issue is being brought up regarding the belief system of one side or the other, and whether the New Testament is presenting one viewpoint over another. But now, through divine providence over the years, and for me it started like 25 years ago, the Lord put upon my heart that He wanted me to study and understand what the Jewish people believe. So I began my process in the summer of the year 2000, and because of that process, I learned, and I still am learning, what the Jewish people today believe. And I don't know if you realize this, but what we call Judaism, who we call Orthodox Jews, they represent the belief system, the doctrinal beliefs of who is called in the New Testament the Pharisees. So today we don't call Jewish people Pharisees, but I don't know when. I never studied and learned that part. But at some point in time, they stopped being called Pharisees, and they started to be called Orthodox Jews. So we have the belief system of the Pharisees present with us today. And as a result, it's possible, and actually in this movement, we're actually living it, that we are still involved in this Jewish religious dispute 2,000 years later. And something else that I'm about to say that I don't know whether you've thought about before, but when everybody says, this is our Bible, this is what we believe, this is what we need to believe, this is what we need to study. Well, when we're doing that as it relates to the New Testament, and people say you need to read and understand your Bible, you need to read and understand the New Testament. Did it ever occur to you that when you read Matthew through John, did it ever occur to you what you're reading? You're reading something that's going on in the first century. So, and we regard this as our Bible, the Word of God, the inspired Word of God. So that which God is focusing our attention on and what He wants us to study and understand. So tomorrow I get up and I said, well, I think I want to do my devotions. I think I want to read my Bible. So now I'm reading something from Matthew to Revelation. And you know what? I'm being forced to read and study. I'm being forced to read and study about things that are happening in the first century. Which begs the question, why is the God of Israel amplifying the first century and the things that are going on in the first century? Well, the answer has to be that somehow that is central and crucial for us to understand the Messiah and for understand the kingdom of God and the things. He wants us to completely focus day after day after day regarding the first century and the things that are going on in the first century. And if that is the case, what is it that we're reading about? What's going on in the first century? This book contains details and information, this book meaning the New Testament, regarding a bitter Jewish religious dispute. Now, let me tell you something that logically makes zero sense. So by and large here, there's probably 99% of the people here, I'm going to guess, that are not Jewish. And now we are living 2,000 years after what we're reading about is taking place. And we're living very far from the land of Israel. We're living, across the ocean in this place called the United States of America. So does it make any logical sense that non-Jews living across the ocean, that in the first century, they didn't even know America existed probably, that non-Jews, in wanting to express their faith and wanting to learn about their faith, that non-Jews 2,000 years later are interested and they're reading about a Jewish religious dispute. Now, why are people that are non-Jewish, why are you interested in a Jewish religious dispute? That don't make any logical sense 2,000 years after the dispute was going on. But that is really, whether you've thought about it or not, that is really the context of how you're trying to believe and understand your faith. You're trying to read, study, and understand about a Jewish religious dispute, and you're not even Jewish. Does that make any sense? That makes no logical sense, but that's how things are. And you know who's not interested in studying about the Jewish religious dispute? The Jews. And the non-Jews are interested in studying about a Jewish religious dispute that nominally, since they're non-Jews, you wouldn't think that they would care about, particularly 2,000 years later. Okay, so who were these groups? Who were these primary groups of Jews that was involved in the religious dispute, and what were they arguing about? All right, now, two of the groups are explicitly mentioned by name in the New Testament. You're very familiar with their names. They're called Pharisees and Sadducees. But the other group is not explicitly mentioned. And this is the Qumran community. They're not mentioned by a specific name like the Qumran community. Or some people, not all people, some people think that they were the Essenes. So the word Essenes doesn't appear in the New Testament. The words Qumran community doesn't appear in the New Testament. And the word Zadok Priest don't appear in the New Testament. And because it doesn't, I have heard some people say, and in what I'm about to say that they say, ironically, they're speaking Greek thought, and they're supposed to be Hebrew teachers, Torah teachers. Okay, so how am I going to define for you the Greek thought that I'm about to express? Well, I'd like to quote a good friend of mine who unfortunately is no longer with us. His name's Brad Scott. And so one day I heard him give an explanation of a difference between Greek thought and Hebrew thought. And he defined it this way. He said, Greek thought is form. Hebrew thought is function. Okay, then he says, well, let me tell you Greek context, the verse before it and the verse after it, or maybe the chapter. And then he says, let me give you Hebrew context. Hebrew context of a verse is the entire Bible. Now, what I just quoted that Brad Scott said is actually profound. And what he's trying to say is exactly right on. So that being the case, I have heard it said by people, even in this movement, I've heard them say, all right, if this issue of the Qumran and the calendar is such a big and important thing, why isn't it stated and mentioned in the New Testament? Why isn't it stated and mentioned? And why isn't it addressed by Yeshua? If the calendar is so important, why isn't it mentioned in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? So you know the means by which they're asking the question? They want to see it in its form. They want to see the words, calendar. They want to see the words, Qumran community. But that's Greek. Hebrew is function. So actually the issue of the Qumran, what they believed, the dispute about what they believed, whether it was valid or not, and even by extension, the calendar, it's there. But it's there by function. Okay, I'll give you another example, and I don't know whether you'll understand this example or not. But I have a detailed teaching, and actually I'm in the process of writing monthly articles for the Yavo magazine from Lion and Lamb Ministries. I did 3 articles last year, and I just did the June article. And what I wrote in the June article, I'm going to be sharing today and tomorrow, plus other things. So the June article just came out today. It's called Israel Ablaze, A Voice Crying in the Wilderness, and it's showing the connection between the ministry of Yochanan the Immerser, John the Baptist, having a ministry of the Spirit and the power of Elijah, and how his ministry is so tied and connected to the Qumran community. And so the issue between these groups is actually there in the Gospels. It's there in the New Testament, but it's presented to us in form. So what I was about to say is that I intend, here I'm intending it to be in the September Yavo article, if I keep to my thoughts and my plans. That article is going to be about the Melchizedek priesthood. Now, regarding Melchizedek, the word Melchizedek is only mentioned twice in the Tanakh. It's mentioned with the story of Abraham, and it's mentioned in Psalm 110, twice. So because it's only mentioned twice, if I'm looking for a form and for it to say Melchizedek priesthood is, and explicitly says and written out like you would want in a Greek way, like tell me explicitly, that's sort of like the Greek way, you're not going to know much about the Melchizedek priesthood. But actually the Melchizedek priesthood and the issue regarding it is a central topic of the entire book of Genesis, but the word's not mentioned. It's there by function. Adam was a Melchizedek priest. Noah was a Melchizedek priest. Jacob was a Melchizedek priest. And you remember the story of Jacob's family, how there were the blessings were split into Judah received the kingly blessing, and Ephraim and Manasseh the firstborn blessing. and the Levites after the sin of the golden calf got the priestly blessing? Well, the three major offices of the Melchizedek priesthood is king, priest, firstborn. So those offices of the Melchizedek priesthood is split within Jacob's family, and the book of Genesis gives you a lot of detailed information about Jacob's family going into Egypt, and how within Jacob's family, how these offices came to be about in his family. And so, like, it's a major subject matter of the overall story that covers most of the book of Genesis, but the word Melchizedek isn't mentioned. So if someone's saying, well, it's the word Melchizedek's mentioned in Genesis chapter 14, but basically you're going to say, we're not going to do we don't have a whole understanding about it, because you're looking for it, but to be explicitly stated, but it is there in function. The functions is everything what, the stories are communicating to you. So, because I brought up Brad Scott, I need to tell you a further story about Brad Scott, because the principle behind the story is a major point of which I'm initially communicating to you about what I'm going to be teaching you today and tomorrow, which is you need to understand this issue by function. All right, so it was approximately 2001, 2002, where in Florida, I was a speaker at a conference that was entitled Restoring the Tabernacle of David, which is supposed to be the teaching about the two houses and the two sticks becoming one. So then Brad and his wife came to the conference. And then I didn't know who Brad and his wife was, and nobody else in this movement knew who he was either. But he came to attend, and so at one of the breaks, Brad and his wife Carol comes up to the table. I didn't know they were Brad and Carol. They were just somebody that came up to the table that was at the conference. And they asked me, and they said, okay, this two-house stuff. Show me. Where's that in the Bible? I want to know where's that in the Bible. And when Brad ended up telling the story later on, he said how I answered him. Now, I don't remember all the details, but he obviously remembered the details, and then he repeated it. And so here's what he said that I said. He said, I said, like, what do you mean? Where is it in the Bible? It's like, what page do I want to show you? It's like everywhere. And I went like, it's everywhere. And he remembered that I said, it's everywhere. And so he didn't think it was anywhere. I mean, show me one place. And I goes, what do you mean? It's everywhere. So then he said, him and Carol went to a breakout session following this, where I went over it systematically. And he said in the middle of the breakout session, he looks at his wife Carol, and Carol looks at him, and he says, oh, we got it. And so I don't know why he did this, but almost every single time I was ever at a conference with Brad, he would come to me. He would say, Eddie, can I please introduce you? I goes, like, okay, yeah, you can if you want, but like, why are you so insistent that you want to introduce me? And I lost track how many times we was at a conference together, and he pleaded and asked to introduce me, and he always introduced me the same way. He would tell this story that I'm telling you. And he would say, I went to Florida because I was determined that I was going to rock Eddie's world, and I was going to set him straight about this heresy, about this teaching about the two houses. But instead, he rocked my world. And then he said, ladies and gentlemen, now let me introduce to you Eddie Chumney. So why he always told that story about himself, which actually didn't put himself in a very favorable light. He told about himself that he was going to change somebody, and then he ended up being changed. And so why he always wanted to tell the story that wouldn't put him necessarily in a favorable light, but like he insisted on it like every single time. So I was thinking about that one day, and I was thinking about this issue and the controversy that it has right now. And just like the two houses wasn't well understood at all. So when something's not understood, when something's new, there's always issues about it, particularly people that don't understand it. They want to question it if they don't understand it. And those that want to make people afraid can easily make them afraid because they don't understand it, and so they get afraid by just saying some negative words about it. So I was thinking about the present issue, about the Qumran, teaching about it and the significance and everything, and also as it relates to the calendar, and where somebody might said, okay, if this is such an important subject in the New Testament, if it's such an important subject in the Gospels, why isn't it addressed? And the thought came to my mind, the exact same answer that I gave to Brad Scott, like, what do you mean, where is it being addressed? If you have eyes to see, if you understand, you study the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you study what the Pharisees believed in the discussions that are going on, it's everywhere. Okay, what book, what chapter you want me to show you? So because it's like everywhere, I've decided to begin a series, which the June Yavo article is the first one about John the Baptist, a voice crying in the wilderness. So the July article is going to be how Yeshua weighs in on the issue. And then the August article is going to be about Paul. And the other day I thought about the title that's going to be for the August issue. And the title that I thought of a couple of days ago is this: Restoring Paul to the Way. Because when you go to your traditional Sunday churches, you know how they've defined Paul? Paul is a dispensationalist. They define Paul as teaching age of law, age of grace. And they define Paul as teaching against the Torah and for Messiah and for grace and for love. That's how he's defined. Now there's some in this movement that views him as still a Pharisee and teaches as a Pharisee. But according to Paul's own testimony in the book of Acts, you know what he says about himself? He says in Acts chapter 24, verse 14, "But this I confess to you, that after the way," which they call a heresy. So who calls the way a heresy? The Pharisees. After the way, which they call a heresy, that is how I worship the God of my fathers. So Paul himself stated that he followed the way. Well, do you know here in the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Qumran community called themselves the Way? Why did they call themselves the Way? Because if you read and understand how they explain their founding, the background of their founding goes back to understanding the history of the office of the high priesthood of Israel. So, as the Lord put upon my heart from December 2022 to March 2023, so this is when I first studied this subject. And approximately 10 years before that, so I don't remember which year, so let's just say for the sake of argument, 2012. I was in Lawton, Oklahoma. I was speaking in Lawton, Oklahoma, and there's a couple brethren there who was at the meetings, and they came up to me and they said to me the following. They said, "Eddie, you need to study and understand the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's important information there, And the people there are following what we believe to be as a biblical calendar, and we just want you to make you aware of this information. And so here's the way I answered them. I said to them, I'm not saying what you're telling me is right. I'm not saying what you're telling me is wrong. It's just that I've never studied the issue, so therefore I can't form an opinion until I study it myself and make a determination myself. But you might be right, and you might be wrong. And I said, but as of now, we got so much going on in the movement. We're trying to teach people coming out of the church that they need to keep the Sabbath, and the festivals, and dietary laws. We're trying to understand that the covenant was made with the house of Jacob. And the house of Jacob is Israel. And if you're in Messiah, you know, he's going to rule over the house of Jacob forever in Luke chapter 1, verses 32 and 33. And we're trying to explain to them that the two houses were split in the northern kingdom and southern kingdom, and the two sticks are going to become one, and Messiah's second coming is related and pertains to this. And we got all these other issues going on. We got so much going on, like adding something more to it is just like, for me at least, and asking me to do it, it's like too much. So therefore, I'm not going to, act on what you're saying at all. But I'll tell you this. Now, the next part of how I answered them is a part of my personality, and this next part we're about to say, there's hardly anybody I know that's like me in this regard. And I said this. I said, when I have time, I'll look at it. When I made that statement, I meant it. But a normal person like you guys, when you say I'll look at it, it may be tomorrow, it may be next week, it may be in the next month. But me, not being normal like you guys, to me, when I'll look at it, means 10 years from now. So you know how, I meant it when I said it, but you know how long it took me till I looked at it? 10 years later. So it came a point in time when I was finishing up what I was doing, and then I said, Lord, what do you want me to do now? And then he put up my heart, okay, look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was 10 years after I said I look at it. So the way I approach things is, all right, give me everything that there is to know. Put it set right in front of me. I'm going to go over it. I want to examine it. I want to see everything. So what I did is I went, to Amazon, eBay, whatever. I put in Dead Sea Scrolls. I put in different information, and I want to find as much as possible, the books that are presently in print that I can order, that I can read, because one book's got to present one thought and not mention something else. Another book's got to say something else. So I want to see the whole picture. So I bought approximately 15 to 18 books. So it took me like 4 months to read them. And one of the books I bought was this one. This is like one of approximately like 3 different versions that is an English translation of the scrolls and the fragments. So that's what this book is. It's an English translation of the scroll and the fragments. So if you want, it's called the Dead Sea Scrolls, a new translation by Michael Wise, Martin Ebbig Jr., and Edward Cook. Okay? I like this because it's bigger print. Another one that was done earlier by Vermes, at least what I got, it was smaller print. So it's like I wanted to read the bigger print. But this here, if you're going to read the scrolls and all the fragments and everything they said, according to how this print is, it's approximately 625 pages. So if you read all of this, you'll find out what the Dead Sea Scrolls say and what the fragments say and what they believe. So if somebody's going to tell me about it, they're probably not going to tell me all the 625 pages. They're going to pick out something or other and tell me something or other, and they're going to, whatever point of view they want to present. I don't want that. I want to know the information myself, so I know what you're telling me, whether you're hitting this angle, that angle, or whether there's something you're excluding, or something like that. So now here's the next irony about it. These 15 to 18 books, there was one Jewish author. And by the way, I would totally recommend hearing and studying and learning the information that she put out. So her name is Rachel Elior. And so she wrote an awesome book explaining all the issues and what's going on. It's called The Three Temples. But she's also have a number of lectures that's out on the YouTube channels and such. And one of the better ones is a lecture that she did 10 years ago at Chicago University, where she lays out the history, what's going on, what the conflict is, and everything. And so she studied the Dead Sea Scrolls for 25 years, Jewish, taught at Hebrew University. And she's just trying to honestly present the historical context because from her perspective, it's a part of Jewish history. And so I read her book, but all the other books were, are you ready for this? By Christian authors. So here's the irony in God's humor. In order for me to understand my Jewish roots and the Jewish roots of the New Testament, God had to send to me Christian authors who don't keep the Sabbath festivals and dietary laws and keep the Torah to teach me about my Jewish roots. And you know what the further irony is? The people who believe in keeping Sabbath festivals and dietary laws want to reject and speak badly against the Jewish roots of their faith. And like I said, the kingdom of God and the ways of God are just full of ironies. Like I presented to you earlier, it don't make sense that non-Jews 2,000 years are studying a first century Jewish conflict. That don't make any sense. It should make sense that the Jewish people should be interested about the Jewish conflict, but they don't care, they're not interested. You don't have a big movement by Judaism to say, oh wow, we've discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a part of Jewish history. Let's see how it relates and pertains to us, and let's share it with the Jewish people. Oh, we don't care. They're just a fringe group out there. They don't believe the right way. And so, why are non-Jews interested in it? So, it doesn't make sense. But anyhow, by reading the totality of these books, particularly this one and others written about the content of the Dead Sea Scrolls, different things were brought out. Things were brought out that's in the New Testament. Things that were brought out that were in the Gospels. In this one book in particular, and I read several really good books by this author. His name's James Vanderkam, and he taught at Notre Dame University. So he's a Christian author. He's not, the best of my knowledge, he's not following Torah, but he worked on the Dead Sea Scroll project, from what I understand, for 20 years. Well, he wrote a book detailing from the days of Nehemiah, the high priest in Israel, to the time of 70 AD, to Caiaphas and further. And that's the only book I've ever come across in my entire life that explained the history of the high priesthood of Israel. So after reading his book and learning about the history of the high priests of Israel, and then realizing that this history of the high priests of Israel is now connected and related to what's going on in the Qumran and why the Qumran was formulated. And all of that is the background and roots to understand the conflict that's going on in the first century and the things going on in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that I'm trying to open up my Bible, read, and understand. That ultimately, if I want to go to the roots of understanding the conflict that we read about among the Jewish people, that John the Baptist and Yeshua is a part of the conflict, I need to go back and understand the history of the high priesthood of Israel. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been a part of this movement for 30 years, and I've been a teacher in the movement for 30 years. And in my 30 years, and all the conferences I went to, and all the things that I've listened to and studied and learned, I don't remember anybody in 30 years giving me a teaching on the history of the high priesthood of Israel. So I couldn't tell you about it because I didn't know the full connection either. But God used Christian authors to help me to understand my Jewish roots and the history of the high priest of Israel, which helps me to understand what's going on in the Qumran and thus the New Testament. So let me give you one example that I'm going to elaborate more either today or tomorrow, depending upon how long it takes me to get to it. That is very much a part of the Jewish conflict, but if we don't realize it, we're just going to read it as a story and go on, and it won't mean anything to us. And so as a example to you, without giving you the fullness of the detail, is Matthew chapter 21, verses 23 to 25. It says, when he, Yeshua, was come into the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came unto him as he was teaching and said, by what authority do you do these things? And who gave you this authority? Now let me tell you what would be normal. See, Yeshua is the one being accused. So, if God forbid, I accused all of you of something, and you were normal, you know what your normal response would be after I accuse all of you of doing something or other? What should come out of your mouth is, well, I mean, you're going to defend yourself. You're going to use the word I, because you're being accused, you're going to defend yourself. So Yeshua's being accused. What would be normal is that he would say, well, I. But guess what? He didn't say I. You know how he answered the question? He says, verse 25, the baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men? Now, to Yeshua, it made perfect sense to answer the question that way. But normally, if you're being accused, you would say I. So he didn't say I. He brings up John the Baptist. So please explain to me what John the Baptist has to do with him being accused of, by what authority do you do these things? Can you make the connection? Well, before I studied what I studied and what I'm explaining to you, I couldn't make the connection. Because the Jewish conflict between the temple system, which had become corrupt in the first century, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and this group in the Qumran community, the number one overriding issue of their conflict was authority. Who had the authority to be the teachers, the leaders of the Jewish people in Israel? Did the Pharisees have the authority? Did the corrupt temple system have the authority? Or did the Qumran? And then the scrolls tells us explicitly that the leadership in the Qumran were Zadok priests. So is it the Zadok priests? Who has the authority? The second thing related and associated with that is, what is the correct interpretation of the Torah? So it's a given that you're going to follow the Torah if you believe in the God of Israel. That's a given. They weren't arguing whether you should keep the Torah. They were arguing how and the proper interpretation. So here we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Yeshua's asked all kinds of questions about the Torah and the interpretation of it. So initially it was over authority. It was over interpretation. And that dispute went on from the formation and the inauguration of the Pharisees and the establishment of the Qumran community. So it says here in the, I think it's in the Damascus document, it tells, here it is, I found it. In the Damascus document, this is what's written in the scrolls. In the era of wrath, 390 years at the time he handed them over to the power of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, from Aaron, that is from the priesthood, a root of planning to inherit the land, we were initially like blind men groping for a way for 20 years, but then he raised up for them a teacher of righteousness to guide them. That gives you a time reference. So the time reference is 390 years after Nebuchadnezzar. So basically, the ultimate Babylonian captivity was 586 BC. You add 390 years, and then they said they were trying to find their way for 20 years. Add another 20 years, and now you get the time reference of the founding of their community. So rounding off, 177 BC. Let's round it off to 175 BC. So this is the time frame that the Dead Sea Scrolls indicate is the founding of their community. What's going on at that point in time? Well, that's the same time of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. That's the same time when we had the people known as the Maccabees that fought a war against Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And so when you celebrate Hanukkah, you hear about what Antiochus Epiphanes tried to impose upon the Jewish people, and then the pushback and the ultimate victory of the Maccabeans over Antiochus Epiphanes IV and the Greek Seleucids. But what you're not told is what happened following the days of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. The king that followed him made a political agreement with the Maccabees, wherein the Maccabees would give the Seleucid king, after Antiochus Epiphanes IV, military support if he needed it. And in exchange, the Greek Seleucid king would recognize the Maccabees for being the high priest in Israel. So they fought against them, but later they made a political agreement with them. So ultimately, it was during this time of the Greek Seleucids where the office of the high priesthood got changed from how it was in the days of David and Solomon. And when it got changed, and who held the office of the high priesthood in Israel from the days of the beginning of the reign of Solomon until this time of Antiochus Epiphanes IV? Who had the office of the high priesthood that entire period? So we're talking, over 700 years. It was Zadok priests. Now all of a sudden they get removed from their office. So what happens? So guess what? If we're talking about the history of the high priesthood of Israel, do you know what we're talking about? We're talking about a temple study. Okay? And so a part of understanding what's going on in the Qumran is it involves and it entails a temple study. You need to study the history of the temple. And you need to understand the history of the temple. Not just the first century temple, but the original temple from what Solomon built. And you start there as the beginning. There's the beginning. So, for example, we're told in 1 Chronicles and chapter 24, 1 Chronicles chapter 24, no, 1 Chronicles chapter 28, 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 11, 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 11, then David gave to Solomon his son the pattern of the porch, the houses, the treasuries, the upper chambers, the inner parlors, the place of the mercy seat, and all the pattern by the Spirit, the courts of the house of the Lord, all the treasuries, dedicated things. And David gave to Solomon the information regarding the courses of the priests and the Levites. So if David gives it to Solomon, so now in Solomon's temple, we have the administration of the courses of the priests that are operating in their office in Solomon's temple. So when Solomon's temple is built, who is the high priest in Israel? It's Zadok the priest. Zadok the priest was the high priest in Israel when Solomon starts his reign. So this Zadok the priest now has the courses of the priests of the Levites. And so who do you think maintained and preserved and kept those courses? The Zadok priests. And the details of those courses and how it's directly related to the priestly calendar that was kept in the Qumran is enumerated here in the scrolls in detail. That the priestly courses is married to the calendar. Without the priestly calendar, you're not going to know what priestly course is serving what week of the year. And the courses were done over a 6-year period. So you had to know, am I in year 1? Am I in year 2? Am I in year 3? Am I in year 4? Year 5? Because the priest that served in week 1 in year 1 is different than the course that serves in week 1 in year 2. So here, this tells us it's tied to the calendar, which the Zadok priests were the administrators in the Qumran. They were the teachers. They were the leaders of the people. And here in the days of Solomon, Zadok was the priest. So who would have the courses and how it was originally done? The Zadok priests. And they enumerated it here in the scrolls. And it's related and connected to the calendar. So in this movement, we have emphasized that we need to go back to the beginning. Now let me make you a very Hebraic statement. That in the Greek, which is black and white, yes and no, my statement I'm about to make don't make sense. But it's very Hebraic. It makes total sense in the Hebraic. And here's the statement. In this movement's effort over the last 25 years to go back to the beginning, which we have, in going back to the beginning, which we have not gone back to the beginning. And God's still trying to get us to the beginning, and we're resisting going back to the beginning. So I apparently made a contradiction, that we've gone back to the beginning, but we haven't gone back to the beginning. But in Hebrew thought, it's not a contradiction. So have we gone back to the beginning? The answer is yes. In what way have we gone back to the beginning? Oh, there's a slew of teachings about the Garden of Eden and what happened on there and its importance, significance. There's a slew of teachings on the book of Genesis. We're every week studying, examining Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. I mean, like, that's all we ever do is study the beginning. And Brad Scott's got a teaching on going through every unique Hebrew word from Genesis chapter 1 to Genesis chapter 11. It's 82 CDs. I've listened to them all. Okay, so he's gone back to the beginning with every Hebrew word. So in us going back to the beginning, which we haven't gone back to the beginning. What's the beginning we haven't gone back to? We haven't gone back to the days of David and Solomon. Because it says in Acts chapter 15, verse 16, that the tabernacle of David had fallen. So we haven't gone back to the beginning and say, how were the days of David and Solomon? How were things in 1 Chronicles chapter 28? Well, in the day when Solomon starts his rule and reign, there's one high priest in Israel. It's Zadok the priest. So have we gone back to the beginning? And then with all of our emphasis of, oh, we don't know the Torah, we don't know the Torah, we don't know the Torah, we don't know the Torah. And by the way, we don't know the Torah, so we got to study the Torah, so we got to keep studying the Torah and the Torah and the Torah. And what is all the Torah that we're studying about that we think that we got to study? We think it's the first 5 books. So in all that, you know what we've really neglected in all of our emphasis on the Torah? We've neglected the New Testament. We've neglected Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you know what else we've neglected? We've neglected understanding Acts chapter 2. So now you know what we need to do? We need to go back to the beginning. And we need to go back to the beginning and we need to ask ourselves, in Acts chapter 2, it says that there were 3,000 Jews that were saved. Now, in my 50 years of going to church, do you know what I've never heard asked? I haven't. Maybe you have, but I haven't. I've never heard asked this question. Who were those 3,000 Jews that were saved? I've heard a zillion times that there were 3,000 Jews, but did anyone ask the question, who were they? Were they Pharisees? Were they Sadducees? Or were they of the Qumran community? Who were the Jewish believers? Okay, and what attributes are we given about them in Acts chapter 2? Because they were, are you ready for this? They were the very first Jewish believers after he resurrected in Yeshua. So the first believers in Yeshua that we have recorded in the New Testament after his resurrection were Jewish believers. Those first Jewish believers, become the roots of our faith. They become the beginning of faith in Yeshua. So if we tried to study and understand what they believed and who they were, because they gave us the foundation of not only belief in Yeshua, but they gave us the foundation of the doctrinal beliefs that in believing that Yeshua is the Messiah. Okay, now what happened after that? Because you've heard over and over and over for the last 25 years, Constantine, 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 Constantine. So you know what I've talked about over the last 20 years? Constantine, 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 Constantine. Okay, we want to go back to Constantine and tell the story. Well, wait a second. We got to go back to Acts chapter 2. Because in Acts chapter 2, it was in Jerusalem. And it was Jewish believers that believed in Yeshua. And another question that we don't ask ourselves, here when we read in Acts chapter 2, verse 1, it says, when the day of Pentecost had fully come. You know what we don't ask ourselves? I've never heard it asked, not even in this movement. You know where I read and it was brought up? In a book that I read in the last 2 years by a Christian author. Okay, and then they said, like, which Pentecost? So when you read the day of Pentecost, do you ask yourself, which Pentecost? Now, I'll tell you something that you are familiar with. There's different ways of counting the Omer. Now, that you're familiar with. So you know the Pharisees do it one way. You know the Sadducees do it one way. And you might be learning that the Qumran community and the priestly calendar does it a third way. Now, if you start counting the Omer on different days, you count the Omer for what reason? To come to 50th day and to celebrate Shavuot or Pentecost. So if you have 3 different ways of counting the Omer and 3 different start dates, that means you what? You have 3 different days that you celebrate the Feast of Shavuot, Pentecost. All right, so if we got 3 different ways of celebrating Shavuot in the first century, and it says in Acts chapter 2, when the day of Pentecost had fully come, which Shavuot? Is that the Pharisaic Shavuot? Is that the Sadducean Shavuot? Or is that the Qumran Shavuot? How do you know? Well, if you know what they study and read what they believe, and then you read what is stated in Acts chapter 2, you can put 2 and 2 together. And if you put 2 and 2 together, you're going to realize it was the Shavuot that the Qumran community celebrated from the attributes that were given in Acts 2, which I'll hopefully go over in greater detail in ensuing messages. And so we are now being taught, are you ready for this? In our movement, it's being exhorted, in our movement, you need to go back to your Jewish roots. And there is resistance in this movement about going back to our Jewish roots, and we think that we're all about going back to our roots. And so we need to go back to our New Testament Jewish roots, which is those that believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. And I'll throw out another thing here, something that we've missed. It's not emphasized. In Acts chapter 6, verse 7, Acts chapter 6, verse 7, it says, there were a great company of priests that were obedient to the faith. It didn't say 1 or 2, a lot. A great company of priests. Okay, did you ever ask yourself, who were these priests? Were they the temple priests? Were they Pharisees? Were they Sadducees? Or were they the Zadok priests in the Qumran? Who were they? They were believers. They're priests. Who were they? Well, just put 2 and 2 together. It starts to make sense. Okay? They're going to be the Zadok priests in the Qumran. So now, the Lord's trying to get us our attention that in all of the direction He's got us into the Torah, now He's saying, okay, I want you to study your Jewish roots, but I want you to see your Jewish roots in the New Testament. Because we sort of like left the New Testament because we forgot the Old. So now we got to go back and emphasize the Old, or the Tanakh, emphasizing the first 5 books. But now He's saying, well, wait, now since you understand that, now go back to the New Testament and see how the New Testament, the Jewish roots in the New Testament, who were the Jewish believers and what did they believe? Because that first congregation in Jerusalem that James was over were Jewish believers. And what did they believe? Because what happened is after the message of Messiah left Jerusalem, after it left the land of Israel, when it went into the Greco-Roman world, the message of and the doctrine and the beliefs of the first Jewish believers gets buried. It gets lost. And the message becomes Greco-Roman. And we inherit the Greco-Roman message. And if you look at a documentary on PBS or something, the History Channel, the history of Christianity, and they're going to talk about okay, Christianity was East and West, the Greek Orthodox Church and the Roman Church. Well, wait a second, that's not the beginning. Okay, and what they believed and did was not the beginning. What they did is they took the Jewish roots and what the first Jewish believers, and they transformed it so a message that would be appealing to the Greco-Roman world. They made Yeshua a Greco-Rome, and then they introduced, he died on the tree to do away with the Torah. And so it's the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the message in the Qumran and the studying of it, the connecting of it, the identification of it, that's going to bring us back to our Jewish roots. And God wants us to re-examine the New Testament now from a Torah perspective. Now with an identification that we're reading and studying about Torah, and we're reading and studying about the New Testament. So I'm going to continue to further elaborate and expand on what I just introduced here in this message. I'm a little bit late, but we're supposed to take a 15-minute break. So we'll take our 15-minute break now, and we'll come back and I'll share with you part 2.